A battle-worn man stands before the woman he loves, his scarred hands trembling as he speaks words that have haunted him for years. "I'm not good enough for you." Every mark on his body tells a story of survival, every wound a reminder of battles fought and barely won. He has carried these scars like shame, believing they make him unworthy of the gentle love she offers freely. She has stayed by his side through sleepless nights and silent struggles, watching him fight demons that follow him home from distant wars. Now, as he braces for the rejection he believes is inevitable, she surprises him with tender fingers that trace each scar with reverence rather than revulsion. "You're perfect for me," she whispers, pressing her lips to the marks he has tried so hard to hide. In that moment, his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. But can love truly heal wounds that run deeper than flesh? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Steele had never been afraid of death. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him that fear was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford, but standing in Elena's apartment, watching her brown eyes search his face for answers he wasn't sure he could give, terror gripped him with more force than any firefight ever had. The dog tags beneath his shirt felt heavier than usual, their familiar weight a constant reminder of who he used to be. He never took them off, not even to shower, not even when Elena's fingers traced the chain's outline through his t-shirt during their quiet moments together. They were Staff Sergeant Marcus Steele's tags, and that man had died in a roadside explosion outside Kandahar 2 years ago. What remained was something broken, something unworthy of the woman who looked at him like he hung the stars. "Marcus," Elena's voice carried the same gentle authority she used with her trauma patients at the VA hospital. "Talk to me." He turned away, focusing on the framed photograph on her mantle. It showed Elena at her nursing school graduation, surrounded by family who smiled with the kind of pride he'd never seen directed at him. Even his own parents had looked at him with worry after his discharge, as if he might explode at any moment. The silence stretched between them until Elena moved closer, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She didn't touch him, but her presence warmed his back like sunlight through a window. "Do you remember the first time we met?" she asked. Marcus closed his eyes, allowing himself to drift back to that sterile VA conference room where Dr. Patterson held his weekly group sessions. Marcus had been attending for 6 months, sitting in the same chair, speaking only when directly addressed, counting the minutes until he could escape back to his empty apartment. Then Elena Torres walked in. She wasn't there as a patient. She was a trauma nurse, doing research for her master's degree, observing how group therapy helped veterans process their experiences. Most of the men straightened up when she entered, some preening under her attention. Marcus had hunched deeper into his chair, pulling his jacket sleeves down to cover the worst of his scars, but Elena hadn't looked at him with pity or revulsion. She'd looked at him with professional curiosity that slowly warmed into something deeper as the weeks passed. She started staying after sessions to help clean up, making small talk with the veterans who seemed most isolated. She never pushed, never pried, just offered her presence like a gift without strings attached. "You were so angry," Elena continued, moving to stand beside him, not at anyone in particular, just angry at the world, at yourself, at the unfairness of coming home when others didn't. Marcus nodded, remembering how her calm presence had slowly chipped away at his defenses. She'd ask simple questions about his day, his appetite, whether he was sleeping, nothing invasive, nothing that demanded he relive his worst moments. Just gentle attention that acknowledged his humanity when he'd forgotten he possessed any. "I was doing my thesis on post-traumatic growth," Elena said. "How some people not only recover from trauma, but actually become stronger because of it. You were my most challenging case study." A bitter laugh escaped Marcus's throat. "Challenging is one way to put it. You want to know what I wrote in my final paper about you?" Marcus didn't answer, but Elena continued anyway. I wrote that Staff Sergeant Marcus Steele represented the complex intersection of survival guilt and moral injury. That beneath his self-protective isolation, he possessed an extraordinary capacity for love that he'd channeled into protecting others during combat. The same impulse that made him an exceptional soldier was slowly destroying him as a civilian, because he had no mission, no one to protect except himself. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Elena, I wrote that his recovery would require someone willing to be protected by his love without being diminished by it. Someone strong enough to love him back without trying to fix him. She moved in front of him then, forcing him to meet her eyes. I never expected that someone to be me. Marcus stared at her, this woman who'd somehow seen past his damage to something worth saving. Elena Torres, who worked 12-hour shifts in the trauma unit and still had energy left to sit with broken veterans, who knitted scarves for homeless patients and remembered everyone's birthday, who chose to love him when walking away would have been so much easier. The dog tags felt cold against his chest, a reminder of the man he'd been before the world taught him that some wounds never heal. But looking into Elena's eyes, Marcus began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't about becoming whole again. Maybe it was about learning to be loved while broken. The prescription bottles rattled like maracas when Marcus opened the bathroom cabinet at 3 in the morning. Sertraline for depression, prazosin for nightmares, lorazepam for panic attacks. The orange containers lined up like plastic soldiers, each one a small defeat he swallowed with his morning coffee. When he took them consistently, the nightmares faded to a manageable whisper. When he didn't, they roared back with a vengeance, dragging him into sweaty, gasping awakenings that left Elena's side of the bed empty and cold. Tonight was one of the bad nights. Marcus sat on the edge of the bathtub, rolling the prazosin bottle between his palms. He'd stopped taking it 3 days ago, telling himself he was getting better, that he didn't need chemical assistance to sleep like a normal person. The irony wasn't lost on him, that a man trained to operate on 2 hours of sleep couldn't manage 8 hours without pharmaceutical intervention. Marcus? Elena's voice drifted through the bathroom door, thick with sleep and concern. He quickly shoved the bottles back into the cabinet, but the rattling sound betrayed him. Elena knocked softly, then pushed the door open when he didn't respond. She wore one of his old army t-shirts, the fabric hanging loose on her smaller frame, and her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders. "Another nightmare?" she asked, settling beside him on the bathtub's edge. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The dream had been particularly vivid tonight. Rodriguez screaming for his mother as blood pooled beneath his shredded legs. Williams trying to hold his intestines inside his body with hands that wouldn't stop shaking it. And Marcus, frozen in that crucial moment when leadership meant the difference between life and death, watching his men die because he'd made the wrong call. "Want to tell me about it?" "Same one as always." Marcus's voice came out rough, like sandpaper against wood. "The IED, my guys." Elena reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his clammy skin. She'd learned not to startle him awake during episodes, not to touch him without warning. 2 years of loving a broken soldier had taught her the careful choreography of comfort. "You stopped taking the prazosin again." It wasn't a question. Elena knew the signs, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, the careful distance he maintained even during their most intimate moments. She was a trauma nurse. Reading the symptoms of PTSD was as natural as checking vital signs. "I hate being dependent on them," Marcus admitted. "Hate that I can't sleep without chemicals altering my brain chemistry. You wouldn't judge a diabetic for taking insulin. That's different." "How?" Marcus pulled his hand away, standing to pace the small bathroom. "Because diabetes isn't a character flaw. Because diabetics don't wake up screaming and scare the woman they love. Because their condition doesn't make them feel like damaged goods that should come with a warning label." Elena absorbed this quietly, her nursing instincts warring with her heart. She'd seen countless veterans struggle with the stigma of mental health treatment, watched strong men crumble under the weight of their own expectations. But watching it happen to Marcus felt like watching someone she loved slowly drown while refusing the life preserver she threw him. "Remember Jake Morrison from Group?" she asked finally. Marcus nodded. Morrison was a Marine who'd done 4 tours in Iraq, a quiet man who spoke rarely but listened intently to everyone else's struggles. "He told me last week that he's been married for 15 years. His wife stuck with him through 3 failed attempts at going off his medications. She finally sat him down and asked if he'd rather be right or be happy. Right meant proving he could handle his PTSD without help. Happy meant taking the pills and being present for his family. What did he choose? He takes his medications every morning with his coffee. They just celebrated their daughter's graduation from college." Marcus stopped pacing, meeting Elena's eyes in the bathroom mirror. His reflection looked haunted, older than his 34 years, marked by invisible wounds that ran deeper than the visible scars mapping his torso. "I'm scared that if I keep taking them, I'll never be able to stop," he whispered. "That this is who I am now. Permanent, a broken soldier who can't function without pharmaceutical assistance." Elena stood and moved behind him, her hands gentle on his shoulders. In the mirror, they looked like a study in contrasts. Her dark beauty unmarked by violence, his pale skin telling stories of survival. "What if," she said softly, "instead of seeing the medications as a crutch, you saw them as tools? A soldier uses whatever equipment he needs to complete the mission successfully. Your mission now is living a full life, being present for the people who love you. If medication helps you accomplish that mission, then it's just good tactical planning." Marcus leaned back against her warmth, feeling some of the night's tension ease from his shoulders. Elena always found ways to reframe his struggles in terms he could understand, translating civilian concepts into the military mindset that still governed his thinking. "Will you stay up with me for a while?" he asked. "As long as you need." Marcus retrieved the prazosin bottle from the cabinet, dry swallowing 1 pill, while Elena watched. Tomorrow he would sleep better. Tomorrow he would be more present, more capable of being the partner she deserved. Tonight he would let her love chase away the ghosts that followed him home from war. Elena folded the hand-knitted blanket she'd been working on for 3 months, the soft blue yarn sliding between her fingers like water. She'd learned to knit during her pediatric rotation in nursing school, finding the repetitive motion soothing during long shifts with sick children. Now the clicking of needles helped her process the complex emotions of loving someone haunted by invisible wounds. The blanket was meant for Marcus, though she hadn't told him yet. Each stitch represented a quiet evening spent watching him struggle with demons she couldn't see, couldn't fight for him. The pattern was simple, practical, nothing fancy or decorative. Marcus didn't appreciate fussy things, preferring function over form in everything from his sparse apartment to his carefully controlled emotional responses. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Carmen. "Still dating the soldier boy? Mom's worried you're wasting your time on someone who can't commit." Elena deleted the message without responding. Her family meant well, but they didn't understand what they saw as her stubborn attachment to a man who might never be normal in their traditional sense. They wanted her to find someone stable, someone without baggage, someone who could give her the white picket fence dream their parents had modeled. But Elena had seen too much in her work to believe in simple definitions of stability. She'd held the hands of dying patients who'd lived seemingly perfect lives until cancer or accidents revealed how fragile security really was. She'd watched families torn apart by addiction, infidelity, and ordinary cruelties that left scars invisible to outsiders. Marcus's wounds were honest, earned in service to something larger than himself. And beneath those wounds, she'd glimpsed a capacity for love that took her breath away. The first time she'd seen it was during a group session 6 months into their friendship. A new veteran had joined the circle, a young woman barely 22, whose convoy had been hit by a suicide bomber. She'd sat rigid with terror, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. Marcus had noticed immediately. Without drawing attention to himself, he'd moved his chair slightly closer to hers, angling his body so she felt protected rather than exposed. When she started hyperventilating during her introduction, Marcus had quietly begun breathing exercises, his calm rhythm giving her some to follow back to safety. After the session, Elena had watched him walk the young veteran to her car, his posture relaxed and non-threatening, his voice too low for Elena to hear the words, but gentle enough that the woman's shoulders gradually unclenched. He'd waited until she drove away safely before returning to the building. "That was beautiful," Elena had said when he rejoined her in the parking lot. Marcus had looked genuinely confused. "What was?" "The way you took care of her without making it obvious. The way you knew exactly what she needed. She was scared. Anyone could see that. But that wasn't true." The other group members had noticed the new veteran's distress, but only Marcus had instinctively known how to help without increasing her anxiety. It was the same protective instinct that made him check locks twice, scan exits when entering restaurants, and position himself between arena and potential threats during crowded events. Elena had grown up with stories of her grandfather's PTSD from Vietnam. Unlike Marcus, Abuelo had never sought treatment, never learned healthy coping mechanisms. He'd medicated his nightmares with alcohol and his hypervigilance with isolation, eventually dying alone in a VA hospital, while his family grieved the man he'd been before the war changed him. Her mother saw Elena's relationship with Marcus as history repeating itself, a granddaughter foolishly attracted to damaged men like her grandfather. But Elena saw the crucial difference. Marcus was fighting for his healing. He attended therapy, took his medications when the symptoms overwhelmed his pride, and trusted her enough to show his vulnerability. The blanket in her hands represented every night she'd held him through flashbacks. Every morning she'd gently coaxed him back to the present, every small victory they'd celebrated together. It was woven from patience and stubbornness and the kind of love that chose to see potential where others saw only problems. Elena's phone rang, Marcus's name appearing on the screen. "Hey," his voice was rough with exhaustion. "Bad day at work." She could hear the genuine concern despite his own struggles, the way he always made space for her needs even when his own threatened to overwhelm him. This was what her family didn't understand. Marcus's trauma didn't make him selfish. If anything, it had made him hyper-aware of others' pain, almost compulsively generous with the compassion he couldn't quite extend to himself. "Just thinking about you," she said, settling deeper into her chair. "How was group today? Rodriguez is getting married next month." Asked if I'd be his best man. Elena smiled, hearing the surprise in Marcus's voice. He still didn't realize how much his quiet strength meant to the other veterans, how his steady presence anchored their small community of healing. "That's wonderful. You said yes, right?" "I said I'd think about it." Standing in front of a crowd, being responsible for someone else's important day. His pause was heavy with doubt. "What if I have an episode? What if I ruin it for him?" Elena fingered the soft yarn of his blanket, each loop a reminder of her commitment to this complicated, beautiful love they were building together. "Then we'll deal with it. Together." Marcus kept the photograph hidden in his sock drawer, beneath layers of military-issued underwear he couldn't bring himself to throw away. The image was creased from being folded and refolded countless times, its edges soft with handling. 5 soldiers grinned at the camera, their faces painted with dust and sweat and the invincible confidence of young men who believed they were bulletproof. Rodriguez on the left, barely 19, holding up a letter from his girlfriend back in San Antonio. Williams in the center, the squad clown who could make anyone laugh, even during the worst firefights. Jackson crouched in front, the medic who'd patched up more wounds than he'd ever trained for. Morrison standing tall behind them all, the father figure of their unit, despite being only 26. Marcus on the right, Staff Sergeant Marcus Steele, the leader who'd brought them all home from 12 months of hell, except he hadn't. Not all of them. The photograph had been taken 3 days before the IED changed everything. Elena found him staring at it one evening, the drawer pulled open, his hands trembling as he held the only record of the men who'd trusted him with their lives. She'd never seen the picture before, though she'd heard fragments of their stories during his worst night. "Tell me about them," she said softly, settling beside him on the bed. Marcus's first instinct was to fold the photograph away, to lock it back in its hiding place, where it couldn't hurt anyone. But Elena's presence steadied him, her calm breathing, reminding him that he was safe in her apartment, far from the roads that had claimed his brothers. "Rodriguez," he began, pointing to the young soldier's grinning face. "Kid from the barrio who joined up to pay for college, wanted to be a teacher. He used to read to the local kids when we were stationed near villages. Taught them English words, basic math." Elena studied Rodriguez's face, noting the youth that reminded her of patients she'd treated. Young men who'd arrived at the VA hospital with bodies too broken for their ages. Williams was our comedian. Guy could find humor in anything. MREs, sandstorms, incoming mortar fire. He kept us sane when everything else was going to hell. Marcus's voice caught slightly. He was planning to do stand-up comedy when he got home. Had this notebook where he wrote down funny things that happened. Said he was going to turn deployment into material. "Jack's best medic I ever served with. Saved more lives than I can count. Had these steady hands, never panicked no matter how bad things got. He was studying pre-med before he enlisted. Planned to become a surgeon when his service ended." Marcus paused, his thumb tracing Morrison's figure in the photograph. Morrison was the old man of the group. Already had 2 deployments under his belt when I got assigned to lead the squad. Could have resented taking orders from someone younger, but he never did, solid as a rock. His wife was pregnant with their first child. Elena absorbed their stories, understanding why their loss haunted Marcus with such intensity. These weren't just soldiers under his command, they were young men with dreams, families, futures that had been cut short by his decision to take that particular route on that particular morning. What happened that day? Marcus closed his eyes, but the memory played behind his lids with documentary precision. The morning briefing, the route selection, the casual conversation as their convoy moved through streets they'd traveled dozens of times before. The split-second decision to take the main road instead of the longer but safer back route because they were running behind schedule. "I chose speed over caution," he said simply. "We were supposed to meet another unit for a joint patrol. I was worried about keeping them waiting, so I took the direct route instead of the secure one we'd used all week." They say AD had been buried in the roadside, triggered by the weight of their lead vehicle. The explosion lifted their Humvee 10 feet into the air, before slamming it back down, the impact crushing Rodriguez and Williams instantly. Jackson survived long enough for Marcus to hold his hand while he bled out, whispering instructions for trauma care, even as his own life leaked away. Morrison made it to the field hospital, but died during emergency surgery, never learning that his daughter had been born healthy the day before. Marcus had walked away with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and shrapnel wounds that would heal into the scars, Elena traced with such tenderness. His body had recovered. His mind remained trapped in that moment when he'd chosen convenience over safety. "I see their faces every time I close my eyes," Marcus whispered. "I hear Rodriguez calling for his mother, Williams making jokes even while he was dying, Jackson trying to save himself with medical knowledge that couldn't overcome massive internal bleeding." Elena took the photograph from his hands, studying each face with the careful attention she gave to patients' charts. "How old were you when this happened?" 32. "So you were responsible for keeping 19 and 20 and 26-year-old men safe in a war zone where people were actively trying to kill you all." Marcus nodded, not understanding where she was leading. "Marcus, you were a soldier, not God. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. The enemy killed your friends, not your choice of route." But Marcus had lived with the weight of command decision for 2 years, and logic couldn't dissolve the guilt that had calcified around his heart like scar tissue. Elena placed the photograph on the nightstand where they could both see it, those 5 young faces grinning at them across time and distance. "They trusted you," she said finally. "All of them. That trust didn't end when they died." Elena's trauma care textbook lay open on the coffee table, its pages marked with highlighted passages and handwritten notes in the margins. She'd kept it from nursing school, not for nostalgia but because it contained the clearest explanations of post-traumatic stress responses she'd ever found. The clinical language helped her understand Marcus's symptoms without reducing him to a diagnosis. Hypervigilance is a state of enhanced alertness, she read aloud while Marcus assembled a bookshelf in her living room. The individual constantly scans the environment for potential threats, leading to exhaustion and difficulty relaxing even in safe situations. Marcus paused in his work, recognizing himself in the textbook definition. He'd been checking Elena's door locks and window latches since arriving that morning, his eyes automatically cataloging exit routes and potential weapons despite knowing her apartment building was secure. "Is that your way of telling me I'm acting paranoid again?" he asked, not defensively but with genuine curiosity. Elena marked her place in the textbook and moved to sit on the floor beside him, watching as he fitted wooden dowels into precisely drilled holes. His movements were methodical, patient, each step completed with the attention to detail that had once kept his squad alive in hostile territory. "I'm trying to understand why you need to know where every exit is located before you can concentrate on anything else," she said. "It's not paranoia if it's an adaptive response to trauma. Your brain learned to prioritize safety, and unlearning that takes time." This was the delicate balance Elena maintained, using her professional knowledge to support Marcus without making him feel like a case study. She'd learned to translate clinical concepts into conversations that honored his experience rather than pathologizing it. Marcus fitted another joint together, the satisfying click of wood meeting wood grounding him in the present moment. "Does the textbook explain why I can't walk into a restaurant without calculating how quickly I could get everyone to safety if something happened?" "Actually, yes." Elena flipped through pages until she found the section on adaptive hypervigilance. "It says that individuals who've experienced combat trauma often retain heightened threat assessment abilities that serve them well in dangerous environments. The challenge is learning when to turn off those systems in civilian context." She didn't mention that the same chapter discussed how this constant state of alertness contributed to exhaustion, relationship difficulties, and social isolation. Marcus was making progress. He didn't need to be reminded of every potential pitfall. "When you check the restaurant exits, are you doing it consciously or automatically?" she asked. Marcus considered this while testing the bookshelf's stability. "Automatically, mostly. It's like breathing. I don't decide to do it, it just happens." Elena nodded, having observed this pattern countless times. Marcus would enter any new environment with a subtle but systematic scan: exit locations, potential weapons, escape routes, possible threats. Most people never noticed, but Elena had learned to recognize the slight tension in his shoulders until he'd completed his assessment. "What would happen if you tried to ignore that impulse? Just walked into a place without checking?" "I've tried." Marcus's voice carried frustration born of repeated failure. "Made it about 5 minutes before the anxiety got so bad I had to leave. It's like trying to ignore a fire alarm. My brain insists something terrible will happen if I don't know how to get out." Elena understood. During her pediatric rotation, she developed her own compulsive checking behaviors around medication dosages, verifying calculations multiple times before administering anything to children. The stakes of making mistakes had been too high to rely on single verification. "What if we reframed it?" she suggested. "Instead of fighting the impulse, what if you used it intentionally? Turn it from an automatic response into a deliberate skill." Marcus looked up from the bookshelf, intrigued, despite himself. "You have situational awareness that most people lack entirely. That's valuable in civilian life too. You notice things others miss, potential problems before they become actual problems. Maybe the goal isn't to turn off that ability, but to control when and how you use it." Elena pulled out her phone and showed him a news article she'd bookmarked. "Remember that shooting at the mall in Denver last month? The security guard who prevented casualties said his military training helped him recognize the threat early and coordinate evacuation. His hypervigilance saved lives." Marcus read the article, recognizing familiar patterns in the veteran security guard's response. The man had noticed suspicious behavior before anyone else, had moved civilians to safety while others were still trying to understand what was happening. "I never thought about it as a skill that could be useful," Marcus admitted. "Most of your trauma responses probably started as survival skills that worked perfectly in combat. The problem isn't that you develop them, it's that your brain doesn't know when to turn them off, because civilian life doesn't send all clear signals." Elena closed the textbook and leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm beneath his t-shirt. "What if we practiced together? Going places where you could consciously use your awareness skills but then deliberately relax once you've done your assessment." Marcus considered this, the idea that his hyper-vigilance might be managed rather than eliminated, appealing to his practical nature. He'd never be able to walk through the world with the casual obliviousness of people who'd never faced real danger, but maybe he didn't need to be constantly on high alert either. "Would you be patient with me while I figure it out?" Elena smiled, thinking of all the small accommodations she'd learned to make, sitting where Marcus could see all entrances, arriving early to restaurants so he could choose seats that felt secure, understanding when crowds became overwhelming and extraction was necessary. "Marcus, I've been patient with you for 2 years. I'm not planning to stop now." The first crack of thunder sent Marcus diving for cover behind Elena's couch, his body moving with trained races before his conscious mind could process what was happening. One moment he'd been washing dishes, the next he was pressed against the hardwood floor, his heart hammering against his ribs as rain began pelting the windows with increasing intensity. Elena dropped the book she'd been reading, watching in frozen horror as Marcus's breathing became rapid and shallow. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal's, seeing threats that existed only in his fractured memory. She'd witnessed his flashbacks before, but never one this severe, never one that transported him so completely away from her living room and back to the mountains of Afghanistan. "Incoming," Marcus shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Get down! Rodriguez, get down!" Elena's nursing training kicked in, overriding her emotional response. She moved slowly, carefully, staying low so she wouldn't appear as a threat to Marcus's combat-confused perception. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky with the deep rumble of distant artillery, and Marcus flinched with each boom, as if dodging actual explosions. "Marcus," she said softly, keeping her voice calm and steady, "you're in my apartment. You're safe. The sound is thunder, not mortar fire." But Marcus was beyond hearing her, his hands pressed against his ears, trying to block out the sound that his brain interpreted as incoming rounds. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his breathing came in short, desperate gasps that Elena recognized as the beginning of hyperventilation. Another thunderclap shook the building, and Marcus rolled toward the corner, his back pressed against the wall, his hands fumbling for weapons that weren't there. "Where's my rifle? Jesus Christ, where's my rifle?" Elena's heart broke watching him relive the worst moments of his military service, helpless against memories that played with documentary precision. She wanted to touch him, to ground him with physical contact, but she'd learned that touching someone mid-flashback could escalate their panic if they mistook her for an enemy. "Marcus, listen to my voice." She tried again, speaking with the same tone she used for panicked patients in the trauma unit. "Count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. The counting technique sometimes worked, giving his mind something concrete to focus on besides the memories. But tonight the storm was too intense, too similar to the artillery barrages that had preceded some of his worst combat experiences. Marcus remained trapped in a nightmare that felt more real than the woman calling his name. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating Marcus's face in stark detail. Elena saw terror there, the kind of raw fear that came from watching friends die, from being responsible for decisions that cost lives. This wasn't just a panic attack, this was Marcus reliving the IED explosion that had killed his squad. "Rodriguez is down," Marcus screamed, his voice breaking. "Medical. We need medical. Jackson, where the hell are you?" Elena made a decision that went against her training but aligned with her heart. She approached Marcus slowly, moving into his line of sight so he could see her coming. When she was close enough to touch, she placed her hands on his shoulders, applying gentle but firm pressure. "Staff Sergeant Steele," she said, using his military rank deliberately. "This is Nurse Torres. Your squad is secure. The area is safe. Do you copy?" Something in Elena's authoritative tone penetrated Marcus's panic. His wild eyes focused on her face, confusion replacing the blind terror as present reality began competing with traumatic memory. "Elena," his voice was small, uncertain. "I'm here. You're in my apartments. There's a thunderstorm outside, but we're safe inside." Marcus looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the familiar furniture, the photographs on the walls, the normal domestic details that proved he wasn't under fire in a foreign country. His breathing began to slow, though his hands still trembled. "How long?" he asked. "About 10 minutes. Marcus closed his eyes, shame flooding through him as awareness fully returned. 10 minutes of Elena watching him lose complete control, screaming at ghosts, diving for cover from weather. 10 minutes of proving exactly how broken he really was. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not meeting her eyes. "God, Elena, I'm so sorry. You don't need to apologize for having PTSD." But Marcus was already pulling away from her touch, wrapping his arms around his knees like a child. "You shouldn't have to see me like this. No one should have to deal with someone who can't tell the difference between thunder and artillery fire." Elena sat beside him on the floor, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close that he felt trapped. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the building, but the worst of Marcus's episode had passed. "Do you want to know what I was thinking while you were having the flashback?" she asked. Marcus shook his head, certain he didn't want to hear about her fear, her disgust, her realization that loving him was a mistake. "I was thinking about how brave your squad must have thought you were, how safe they felt with you leading them. Even in the middle of a flashback, you were trying to protect Rodriguez, calling for medical help for your wounded. Your brain was reliving trauma, but your instincts were still focused on saving others." Marcus stared at her, not understanding how she could find anything admirable in his breakdown. "That's who you are, Marcus. Even at your most vulnerable, your first impulse is to protect people. That's not broken. That's beautiful." Elena's grandmother's wedding ring caught the morning light as she poured coffee with hands that still trembled slightly from the previous night's storm. She wore the simple gold band on her right hand, a family tradition that honored the woman who had loved her grandfather through 43 years of marriage, despite his own battles with wartime demons. Abuelo Carmen had never spoken much about Abuelo's nightmares, his drinking, the way he'd sometimes disappear for days when the memories became too heavy to carry. But she'd kept his picture on her dresser until the day she died, and the love in her eyes when she spoke his name had taught Elena that some kinds of devotion transcend conventional understanding. Marcus sat at the kitchen table staring into his untouched coffee, as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The morning after severe episodes always brought this heavy silence, the weight of shame settling over him like fog. He'd showered and dressed with military precision, but Elena could see the exhaustion in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself as if sudden movements might trigger another breakdown. "I scared you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena settled into the chair across from him, the same chair where they'd shared hundreds of quiet mornings, where she'd learned to read his moods in the set of his jaw and the tension around his eyes. "You had a severe flashback during a thunderstorm. That's not the same as scaring me." Elena. Marcus looked up, and she saw something desperate in his expression. "Last night you watched me lose complete control. I couldn't tell the difference between your living room and a war zone. I screamed at dead men and dove for cover from weather. If that's not terrifying, I don't know what is." Elena reached across the table, her fingers finding his scarred hands. The ring on her finger pressed against his knuckles, warm metal against skin that had seen too much violence. "Do you know what terrified me? The thought that you might hurt yourself during the episode. The possibility that the flashback might be so severe you couldn't find your way back to me." Marcus pulled his hands away, standing to pace the small kitchen with restless energy. This is exactly what I was trying to tell you yesterday. I'm not good enough for you, Elena. I'm damaged goods, broken beyond repair. You deserve someone who doesn't fall apart when the weather gets dramatic. Stop. Elena's voice carried the firm authority she used with patients who were spiraling toward self-destructive conclusions. Stop deciding what I deserve. Stop making choices for me about what I can and can't handle. Marcus turned to face her, confusion replacing some of the self-loathing in his expression. Elena stood, moving to the kitchen counter where the morning light illuminated the silver threads in her dark hair, the quiet strength in her posture that had first attracted him to her. Marcus, do you remember the first thing I said to you after your flashback ended? He shook his head, those minutes still hazy with adrenaline and disorientation. I told you that even in the middle of reliving your worst trauma, your instincts were focused on protecting others. Do you know why that matters to me? Marcus waited, not trusting himself to speak. Elena walked to him slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, the same approach she'd used during his episode. When she reached him, she placed her palms flat against his chest, feeling his heartbeat through the thin cotton of his t-shirt. Because it tells me who you really are underneath all the damage, not broken. Marcus, wounded. There's a difference. She moved her hands to his face, her fingers tracing the small scar above his left eyebrow where shrapnel had grazed him during the explosion. Marcus instinctively tried to turn away from her touch, but she held him gently in place. This scar, she said, her thumb brushing over the raised skin, came from the same explosion that killed your friends. You carry their deaths on your body and in your heart, but you also carry their love, their trust, their belief that you would bring them home safely. Her fingers moved to the longer scar along his jaw, a souvenir from flying glass when their convoy hit the IED. This one represents the moment your world exploded. But you survived, Marcus. You came home, you sought help. You learned to trust me enough to let me see your worst moments. Elena's touch was reverent rather than pitying, her fingers mapping his scars like a benediction instead of an inventory of damage. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the armor of self-hatred he'd worn since returning from deployment. Every mark on your body tells a story of survival, Elena continued, her voice soft but certain. Every nightmare, every flashback, every moment of hypervigilance proves that you're fighting to heal. That's not broken, Marcus. That's extraordinary courage. She rose on her toes to press her lips against the scar on his forehead, the same gesture she'd made the night before when he'd confessed his unworthiness. But this time, Marcus didn't try to pull away. You're perfect for me, Elena whispered against his skin. Not despite your scars, but because of the strength it took to survive them. Because of the love you're brave enough to offer, despite believing you don't deserve it in return. Marcus's carefully constructed walls finally crumbled completely, 40 years of military stoicism dissolving under Elena's tender certainty. For the first time since the explosion that had changed everything, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he might be worthy of the love she offered so freely. The leather journal Elena had given him sat unopened on Marcus's nightstand for 3 weeks, before he finally picked up a pen. She'd suggested it during one of their quiet conversations after his thunderstorm breakdown, not as an assignment or therapeutic requirement, but as a tool that might help him process the thoughts that circled endlessly through his mind like vultures. I don't know what to write, he'd protested, handling the journal like it might explode. Write anything, Elena had said. Write about your day, your dreams, your coffee. Write about what makes you angry, or scared, or hopeful. There's no wrong way to do it. Now Marcus stared at the first blank page, its clean lines both inviting and intimidating. He'd kept detailed reports during his military service, documenting everything from supply inventories to after-action reviews with precise clinical language. But this felt different, personal, dangerous. Finally, he wrote the date at the top of the page and began, Elena says writing might help me sort through the mess in my head. Don't know if she's right, but figure it's worth trying. Had another nightmare last night, but this time I didn't wake up screaming. Progress, I guess. The words looked strange in his handwriting, Too honest and vulnerable for someone trained to suppress emotion in favor of mission effectiveness. But something about seeing his thoughts on paper made them feel more manageable, less like toxic waste poisoning his mind, and more like problems that might have solutions. I keep thinking about what Elena said after the flashback, about how even during the episode, I was trying to protect Rodriguez and call for medical help. Never thought about it that way before. Always focused on how I fell apart, not on what that falling apart revealed about who I am underneath the damage. Marcus paused, his pen hovering over the page. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft sound of Elena moving around the kitchen, preparing lunch with the same gentle efficiency she brought to everything. She'd given him space to write without making it feel like surveillance, understanding that vulnerability required privacy even in the safety of their relationship. Elena traced my scars yesterday and called them beautiful, not the scars themselves, but what they represent: survival, courage, the decision to keep fighting even when everything feels hopeless. I've spent 2 years seeing them as proof of my brokenness, but maybe she's right. Maybe they're proof of my strength instead. Writing felt like performing surgery on his own thoughts, cutting through layers of protective numbness to reach the infection beneath. It hurt, but it was the clean pain of healing, rather than the dull ache of festering wounds. Rodriguez would be 21 now, probably married to that girl from San Antonio, maybe teaching elementary school like he always planned. Williams would have his comedy career, making people laugh instead of just making soldiers laugh. Jackson would be in medical school, saving lives with those steady hands. Marcus's grip tightened on the pen, but he forced himself to continue writing instead of slamming the journal shut. They're dead because I chose speed over safety. That's a fact I can't change. But Elena asked me something yesterday that I can't stop thinking about. What would they want me to do with the life their deaths gave me? Would they want me to waste it on guilt and self-hatred, or would they want me to honor their memory by living fully, loving deeply, becoming the man they believed I could be? The question felt like a revelation. Marcus had spent 2 years focused on his failure to bring them home, but he'd never considered what his continued self-destruction meant to their sacrifice. If their deaths had purchased his survival, then wasting that survival seemed like a betrayal of their memory. Elena doesn't see me as damaged goods. She sees me as someone worth fighting for, worth loving, worth believing in. Maybe it's time I started seeing myself through her eyes, instead of through the lens of my worst moment. Marcus closed the journal and set it back on the nightstand, but he didn't hide it in the drawer this time. Writing had felt like confession, like finally admitting truths he'd been too afraid to acknowledge, even to himself. The words on the page weren't pretty or comfortable, but they were honest. Elena appeared in the doorway, drawn by the silence that followed the scratch of pen on paper. She didn't ask what he'd written, respecting the privacy of his process, but her smile suggested she understood the significance of seeing the journal in his hands, rather than gathering dust. How did it feel, she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously, trying to find words for the complex mixture of relief and vulnerability that came with externalizing his internal chaos. Like lancing a wound, he said finally. Painful but necessary. Elena nodded, understanding the medical metaphor. Sometimes we have to make things worse before they can get better. Marcus reached for her hand, pulling her down to sit beside him on the bed. For the first time in months, he felt like he had something to offer her, besides his damage. Not healing, not wholeness, but honest effort toward both. Thank you, he said, for seeing me as someone worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. Elena squeezed his hand, her grandmother's ring warm against his palm. You were always worth saving, Marcus. You just needed help, remember it. The appointment card was simple white cardstock, with blue lettering. Dr. Sarah Chen, Marriage and Family Therapy. Thursday 2:00 p.m. Marcus turned it over in his hands like a foreign object, something that might explode if handled improperly. The idea of sitting in a room with Elena and a stranger, dissecting their relationship and his trauma for professional analysis, made his skin crawl with institutional memories. I don't need someone else telling me I'm broken, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Elena sat beside him on the couch, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close that he felt cornered. She'd learned to give him space when discussing difficult topics, understanding that his military training made him wary of anything that resembled interrogation. Chen specializes in couples dealing with PTSD. Elena said gently, "She's not there to fix you, Marcus. She's there to help us communicate better, to give us tools for handling the hard moments together." Marcus knew Elena was right, but admitting they needed professional help felt like acknowledging defeat. He'd survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, had led men through combat situations that would have broken most people, but he couldn't figure out how to love his girlfriend without dragging her into his darkness. What if she takes one look at me and recommends you find someone less complicated? The question revealed more vulnerability than Marcus intended, his deepest fear dressed up as practical concern. Elena's expression softened with understanding. "Marcus, I've been with you through flashbacks, panic attacks, and nights when you couldn't sleep because the nightmares were too vivid. Do you really think a therapist could tell me something about you that would change how I feel?" The appointment card felt heavier in Marcus's hands, weighted with possibility and terror in equal measure. He'd been in therapy before, VA-mandated sessions with overworked psychologists who treated PTSD like a checklist of symptoms to manage, rather than a complex reorganization of how his brain processed reality. But this would be different. This would involve Ilona, would require him to be vulnerable in front of the person whose opinion mattered most. "I've never done couples therapy," he admitted. "Don't really know what to expect." "Neither have I," Ilona said, but Patterson referred her specifically because she understands military trauma. She's worked with a lot of couples like us. The phrase "couples like us" struck Marcus with unexpected comfort. He'd felt so isolated in his struggle, so convinced that his problems were uniquely unsolvable, that the idea of other couples navigating similar challenges hadn't occurred to him. Maybe he and Elena weren't pioneering uncharted territory after all. Rodriguez mentioned that he and Maria went to couples counseling before they got engaged. Marcus said, thinking of his friend from group therapy. Said it helped them figure out how to talk about his deployment experiences without Maria feeling shut out. Elena nodded, having met Rodriguez's fiancé at a few group social events. Maria struck her as someone who understood the careful balance required when loving a combat veteran, patient but not enabling, supportive but not sacrificing her own needs. "What scares you most about going?" Elena asked, her nurse's intuition, recognizing that Marcus's resistance came from fear rather than stubbornness. Marcus considered the question seriously, talking about us like we're a problem to be solved. Having someone analyze our relationship and find it wanting, discovering that loving me is harder on you than you've been letting on. The honesty of his answer made Elena's chest ache with protective tenderness. Marcus's self-worth remained so fragile that even positive steps toward healing felt like potential confirmation of his unworthiness. "What if," Elena said carefully, "instead of seeing therapy as a judgment on our relationship, we saw it as an investment in our future? Like learning better communication skills or conflict resolution techniques." Marcus looked at the appointment card again, trying to reframe it from evidence of failure to tool for improvement. His military training had taught him that preparation and proper equipment were essential for mission success. Maybe therapy was just relationship equipment he hadn't known they needed. "Dr. Chen requires both partners to commit to at least 6 sessions, Elena continued. "Not because she thinks we're broken, but because building new patterns takes time and practice. 6 sessions. Marcus could handle 6 sessions. That was manageable, finite, not the open-ended psychological excavation he'd feared. "And if it doesn't help, then we try something else. But Marcus, we can't keep handling your PTSD episodes and my emotional exhaustion through trial and error. We need professional guidance. Not because we're failing, but because we're serious about succeeding." Elena's practical approach appealed to Marcus's solution-oriented mindset. This wasn't about admitting defeat, it was about acknowledging that some problems required specialized knowledge to solve effectively. "Okay," he said finally, pocketing the appointment card. but if she suggests we do trust falls or role-playing exercises, I'm out." Elena laughed, the sound bright with relief and affection. "Deal. Though I should probably warn you that she might ask us to practice active listening techniques." "I can handle active listening, just don't expect me to share my feelings with hand puppets." The joke was small, but it represented progress. Marcus making light of therapy meant he was no longer seeing it as an existential threat to his dignity or their relationship. They could do this together, could learn to love each other more skillfully, could build something stronger than what trauma had tried to destroy. The letter from Colonel Davidson arrived on a Tuesday morning, the official army letterhead making Marcus's hands shake as he opened the envelope. He'd been expecting routine paperwork, maybe something about veteran benefits or medical records, but the contents caught him completely off guard. "Staff Sergeant Steele, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been meaning to write since your discharge, but frankly wasn't sure what to say. How do you properly thank someone who saved your life and the lives of countless others? I wanted you to know that the investigation into the IED incident that claimed Rodriguez, Williams, Jackson, and Morrison has been completed. The Army's final report concluded that your tactical decisions were sound and appropriate given the intelligence available at the time. The device was sophisticated, designed specifically to target our standard patrol routes, and would have been nearly impossible to detect using our standard protocols." Marcus had to stop reading, his vision blurring as 2 years of carried guilt crashed against this official acknowledgement of what Elena had been telling him all along. The investigation he'd never known was happening had vindicated decisions he'd been torturing himself over since the explosion. Elena found him at the kitchen table an hour later, the letter spread before him like evidence in a trial he'd been conducting against himself. She could see from his posture that something significant had shifted, the rigid tension in his shoulders replaced by something that looked almost like relief. "The Army investigated the IED attack," Marcus said without looking up. "Colonel Davidson says my decisions were tactically sound, that the bomb was designed to be undetectable, using standard protocols." Elena sat beside him, reading over his shoulder as he continued through the letter. "More importantly, I want you to know how your leadership during and after the explosion prevented additional casualties. Your calm coordination of the medical evacuation and area security saved the lives of the other convoy members. The medics reported that your field treatment of Jackson's injuries gave him an additional 20 minutes of life that allowed him to say goodbye to his family via radio. The men who served under you speak of your leadership with profound respect. They credit your training and decision-making with bringing them home safely from dozens of dangerous missions. The loss of Rodriguez, Williams, Jackson, and Morrison was a tragedy, but it was not the result of leadership failure. You served with distinction, Staff Sergeant Steele. The Army and your country owe you a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid." Marcus's hands trembled as he read the letter a second time, absorbing words that contradicted every assumption he'd made about his final mission. For 2 years, he'd carried the weight of believing his leadership had killed his men. Now official military investigation was telling him he'd done everything right. "Jackson lived an extra 20 minutes because of your medical training," Elena said softly. "He got to say goodbye to his family because of decisions you made under fire." Marcus nodded, remembering those frantic moments after the explosion, when his own injuries seemed irrelevant compared to the need to save his wounded soldiers. He'd applied pressure to Jackson's abdominal wounds while coordinating helicopter evacuation and maintaining security, his training overriding the shock that would have paralyzed most people. "I never knew there was an investigation," he admitted. "Never thought to ask if the Army had analyzed what happened. I just assumed. You assumed the worst about yourself because that felt safer than hoping you might not be responsible." Elena's observation struck him with uncomfortable accuracy. Accepting guilt for his squad's deaths had been easier than living with uncertainty, than hoping he might be blameless and risking disappointment. Guilt was familiar, manageable. Absolution was terrifying because it required rebuilding his entire understanding of himself. "The Bronze Star Medal you were awarded reflects the Army's recognition of your exceptional leadership under fire. I encourage you to remember that honor when civilian life feels overwhelming. You are a decorated veteran, who served with courage and distinction. I hope you're finding peace in your transition home. Your service mattered. Staff Sergeant, your leadership saved lives. Your sacrifice and that of your fallen brothers will not be forgotten. Respectfully, Colonel James Davidson, 3rd Brigade Combat Team. Marcus folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and reverent. The bronze star mentioned in Davidson's letter sat in a box in his closet, unworn and unacknowledged because he'd believed he didn't deserve military recognition for a mission that had cost 4 lives. Alina, what if I've been wrong about everything? What if I've spent 2 years hating myself for something that wasn't my fault? Alina reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his scarred ones. Then you've spent 2 years punishing yourself for being human in an impossible situation, and now you have a choice about what to do with the rest of your life. Marcus stared at the letter, feeling the foundations of his self-loathing begin to crack. If Colonel Davidson was right, if the official investigation had found his leadership sound, then maybe Alina had been right all along. Maybe his scars represented survival rather than failure. Maybe his nightmares were the normal response to abnormal circumstances rather than evidence of moral weakness. I don't know how to stop feeling guilty, he admitted. Don't know how to just turn off 2 years of believing I killed my own men. You don't turn it off all at once, Alina said. You question it a little more each day until doubt becomes possibility, and possibility becomes acceptance. Marcus looked at the woman who'd loved him through his worst moments, who'd refused to let him destroy himself with misplaced guilt, who'd seen his worth even when official military documentation couldn't convince him he possessed any. Will you help me learn to forgive myself? Alina's smile was radiant with hope and determination. I've been trying to help you do that since the day we met. Now we just have better ammunition. The photograph on Elena's dresser showed her parents cutting their 40th anniversary cake, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from weathering decades of life together. Elena studied their expressions as she brushed her hair before bed, noting the laugh lines around her mother's eyes and the way her father's hand rested protectively on her mother's shoulder. They hadn't had an easy marriage. Elena remembered her father's long absences during her childhood, when construction work took him to distant job sites, her mother's quiet tears during economic downturns when money became scarce. There had been arguments about finances, disagreements about parenting, periods when they'd seemed more like roommates than lovers, but they'd never stopped choosing each other. Marcus emerged from the bathroom, his hair still damp from the shower, wearing the soft cotton t-shirt Elena had bought him because it didn't irritate the sensitive scar tissue across his shoulders. He moved more easily now, 6 months of couples therapy having taught him that his hypervigilance could be managed rather than eliminated. Your parents look happy, he observed, noticing her focus on the anniversary photo. They are now, Elena said. But it took them years to figure out how to be happy together. Mom says the first 10 years were about survival, the second 10 were about understanding, and everything after that was about choosing love, even when it wasn't easy. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his attention fully focused on Elena's words. Therapy had taught him to listen, not just to what she said, but to what she needed him to hear, and tonight she seemed to be working through something important. Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough for this, Elena continued, her voice softer than usual. Not for loving you, but for all the work that comes with it. The therapy appointments, the careful navigation around your triggers, the constant awareness of how my actions might affect your mental state. Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar panic. This was the conversation he'd been dreading. The moment when Elena finally acknowledged that loving him required more energy than she possessed. But Dr. Chen's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him to listen without immediately assuming rejection. Tell me more about that, he said, using the active listening techniques they'd practiced. Elena turned from the mirror to face him, her expression honest but not unkind. I love you, Marcus. That's never been in question, but some days I feel like I'm walking through a minefield, trying to provide support without enabling, trying to be patient without sacrificing my own needs. Marcus nodded, recognizing the exhaustion Elena tried so hard to hide. He'd been so focused on his own healing that he'd sometimes forgotten the emotional labor his recovery required from her. Last week, when you had the panic attack at the grocery store, Elena continued, my first thought wasn't concern for you. It was exhaustion at the idea of managing another public episode, getting you home safely, helping you process what triggered it. The honesty of her admission hit Marcus like physical pain, but he forced himself to keep listening instead of shutting down or becoming defensive. Then I felt guilty for being exhausted, which made me angry at myself, which made me resentful that I can't just have normal reactions to my boyfriend's mental health struggles. Elena's laugh held no humor. It's like emotional whiplash sometimes. Marcus reached for her hand, surprised when she didn't pull away. Elena, you're allowed to be tired. You're allowed to have limits. You're allowed to need support too. I know that intellectually, but emotionally it feels selfish to complain about the secondary effects of your trauma when you're the one who actually lived through combat. This was the conversation Dr. Chen had warned them about. The moment when the non-veteran partner finally voiced the accumulated stress of loving someone with PTSD. Elena had been so focused on being understanding, so committed to not adding to Marcus's burden, that she'd buried her own needs until they threatened to overwhelm her. What do you need from me? Marcus asked, proud that his first impulse was support rather than self-defense. Elena considered the question seriously. I need to know that my feelings matter too. That when I'm overwhelmed or scared or frustrated, you won't interpret it as rejection of you personally. Your feelings do matter, more than you know. I need us to have conversations that aren't about your therapy or your triggers or your progress. I need to feel like your girlfriend, not just your support system. Marcus absorbed this, understanding that Elena needed their relationship to include joy and spontaneity, alongside the careful management of his mental health. And I need you to take more responsibility for your own healing. Elena continued, not because I don't want to support you, but because watching you struggle without feeling like I can help is breaking my heart. Marcus stood and moved to face her, taking both her hands in his. Elena, you've already saved my life just by staying. But you're right. I've been so afraid of losing you that I forgot you need things from me too. Elena's eyes filled with tears, relief evident in her expression. I don't want to leave, Marcus. I want this to work. But I need to know we're building something together, not just managing your trauma together. Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her with the careful tenderness he'd learned through months of practice. Then, let's build something beautiful. Something that honors both our strengths and acknowledges both our needs. Elena melted against him, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt like they were truly partners rather than patient and caregiver. Marcus circled the date on Elena's kitchen calendar with red ink. October. 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, no nightmares, no cold sweats that left the sheets damp with fear. The first full night's rest he'd achieved in over 2 years felt worthy of commemoration, like a personal holiday marking his slow return to normal human functioning. Elena found him staring at the calendar while his coffee grew cold, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She'd learned to recognize these moments of quiet victory, the incremental progress that was easy to overlook amid the larger struggles, but represented genuine healing nonetheless. How do you feel? She asked, moving to stand beside him at the counter. Marcus considered the question seriously, taking inventory of his body and mind the way he'd once checked equipment before missions. Rested, he said finally, as if the word was foreign in his mouth. Actually rested, not just exhausted enough to pass out. The difference was significant. For months, Marcus's sleep had been less about restoration and more about unconsciousness, his body shutting down from exhaustion rather than settling into natural rhythms. He'd wake feeling as tired as when he'd gone to bed, his dreams populated by ghosts and explosions that made rest impossible. But last night had been different. He'd fallen asleep reading beside Elena, the book sliding from his fingers as drowsiness overtook him naturally. No medications, no meditation exercises, no careful preparation rituals, just the simple human act of becoming tired and letting sleep claim him. The nightmares didn't come. he continued, touching the calendar date like a talisman. I dreamed about building something, a house, maybe, or a garden. Can't remember the details, but it was peaceful, constructive instead of destructive. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, understanding the magnitude of this seemingly small victory. She'd spent countless nights lying awake beside Marcus, listening to his breathing for signs that the nightmares were starting, ready to wake him gently for the flashbacks became too severe. Chen said the brain needs time to rewire itself, Elena said. That healing happens in fits and starts, not in straight lines. Marcus nodded, remembering their therapist's explanation of neuroplasticity, how repeated positive experiences could literally reshape the neural pathways carved by trauma. One night of peaceful sleep wouldn't cure his PTSD, but it proved that improvement was possible. I was thinking, Marcus said, turning from the calendar to face Elena. Maybe we could do something to celebrate. Not just this, but all the small victories we don't usually acknowledge. Elena's eyebrows rose with interest. What kind of something? I don't know. Something normal. Something that regular couples do without thinking about whether it might trigger a panic attack or flashback. The request revealed how much Marcus had missed the simple pleasures of ordinary relationships for 2 years. Their activities had been carefully curated around his limitations, their spontaneity sacrificed to the demands of managing his mental health. We could go to that farmer's market you mentioned, Elena suggested. The one downtown with the live music and food trucks. Marcus felt his automatic anxiety response begin, his mind immediately cataloguing potential problems, crowds, unexpected noises, limited escape routes. But instead of letting the fear make the decision, he forced himself to consider the possibilities alongside the risks. Crowds make me nervous, he admitted. But maybe nervous is different from terrified. Maybe I can handle nervous now. Elena recognized the significance of his willingness to distinguish between manageable discomfort and overwhelming panic. 6 months ago, Marcus would have rejected any activity that caused anxiety. Now he was considering whether some anxiety might be acceptable in service of living more fully. We could go early, before it gets crowded, she offered. And if you need to leave, we leave. No questions, no guilt. Marcus appreciated Elena's practical approach, the way she offered solutions rather than dismissing his concerns. This was the partnership they'd been building through months of therapy and honest conversation, each of them contributing their strengths to overcome their individual limitations. There's a veterans group that meets at the community center on Saturdays, Marcus said. Rodriguez invited me a few times, but I always made excuses. Maybe it's time to stop making excuses. Elena understood that this represented a different kind of courage than he'd shown in combat. Military bravery involved facing external enemies, but civilian courage required confronting internal demons, admitting vulnerability, accepting help from others. What changed your mind? Marcus looked at the red circle on the calendar, that small mark representing hope, made tangible. I slept through the night without nightmares. If I can do that, maybe I can do other things that used to seem impossible. Elena reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had developed over months of learning to touch each other, despite his trauma responses. Small victories, she said. Small victories, Marcus agreed. But they're adding up to something bigger. Outside, the October morning was bright with the kind of light that made possibilities seem achievable. Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Optimism about the future, curiosity about what they might build together now that healing was proving possible. For the first time in 2 years, tomorrow felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. The engagement ring Marcus crafted from his dog tags wasn't traditional by anyone's standards, but it was perfectly them. He'd spent weeks learning metalworking from a veteran in his support group, melting down the aluminum identification discs that had once marked him as military property and reshaping them into something that symbolized choice rather than duty. Elena discovered him working in the garage behind his apartment building on a cold November evening, the small torch casting dancing shadows on the walls as he carefully shaped metal that had once carried his name, rank, and blood type. The transformation was deliberate, symbolic, beautiful in its imperfection. "What are you making?" she asked, though her heart already suspected the answer. Marcus looked up from his work, his face flushed with heat and concentration. The dog tags he'd worn for 15 years lay in pieces around his workstation, no longer recognizable as military identification, but not yet reformed into their final purpose. "Something new from something old," he said, setting down the torch with careful precision. "Something that represents who I'm becoming instead of who I used to be." Elena moved closer, watching as he shaped the soft metal with tools borrowed from his neighbor, a jewelry maker who'd been patient with Marcus's inexperience, but impressed by his determination. The ring taking shape under his hands was simple, unadorned, but unmistakably handmade with love. "Elena," Marcus said, not looking up from his work, "I know I'm not the easiest man to love. I know my PTSD will always be part of our lives, that I'll never be completely normal in the way some men are." Elena felt her breath catch, recognizing the careful preparation that had gone into this moment. Marcus didn't do anything spontaneously anymore. Every important decision was considered from multiple angles, planned with military thoroughness. "But I also know that you love me anyway. Not despite my scars, but including them. You've taught me that broken doesn't mean worthless, that healing doesn't require perfection." Marcus finished shaping the ring and held it up to the light, examining his handiwork with critical eyes. The metal bore the subtle marks of amateur craftsmanship, tiny imperfections that would have horrified a professional jeweler, but somehow made it more beautiful to Elena's eyes. "These dog tags were supposed to identify my body if I died in combat." Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying his words. "But I didn't die, I came home. And I met you, and you helped me remember that coming home doesn't have to mean just surviving. It can mean living." Elena's eyes filled with tears as Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, the warm metal fitting perfectly against her skin. It was weightless compared to the heavy identification tags it had once been, transformed from a symbol of potential death into a promise of shared life. "Elena Torres," Marcus said, taking her other hand in both of his. "Will you marry me? Will you take on my nightmares and my healing, my progress and my setbacks? Will you build something beautiful with me out of all the broken pieces we've both been carrying?" Elena looked at the ring on her finger, seeing not amateur metalwork, but the most thoughtful proposal she could have imagined. Marcus had literally transformed the symbols of his military service into an offering of his civilian future, melting down his past identity to create space for who they might become together. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, with the certainty that had sustained her through 2 years of loving a combat veteran. "Yes, Marcus, I want all of it. The healing and the setbacks, the progress and the nightmares. I want to build something beautiful with you." Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her with the careful strength she'd learned to trust completely. Her cheese mold of metal and fire and possibility, the tools of transformation scattered across the workbench, where he'd reshaped both aluminum and his understanding of what he deserved. "The ring isn't perfect," Marcus said against her head. "It's a little uneven, and the metal isn't expensive. It's perfect because you made it," Elena replied, admiring the way the simple band caught the overhead light. "Because you took something that represented your worst fears and turned it into something that represents our best hopes." Marcus understood that Elena saw the symbolism as clearly as he did. The dog tags had been about identification in death. The ring was about commitment in life. The transformation from one to the other paralleled his own journey from someone defined by trauma to someone capable of love and partnership. "Rodriguez is going to cry when we tell him," Elena said, thinking of their friend from group therapy who'd been encouraging Marcus toward this step for months. "Rodriguez cries at commercials," Marcus replied, but his smile was warm with affection for the man who'd become like a brother to him. Elena held up her hand, watching the ring catch the light. It wasn't the engagement she'd imagined as a little girl, but it was better because it was real, forged from actual experience rather than fairy tale expectations. "When do you want to get married?" she asked. "Tomorrow." if you're ready. I've wasted enough time believing I didn't deserve happiness. Elena kissed him then, tasting metal and hope, and the future they would build together from the raw materials of love and determination. The wedding vows lay spread across Elena's kitchen table in both their handwritings, her neat cursive intertwined with Marcus's precise block letters, as they crafted promises that acknowledged their unique challenges while embracing their shared future. They'd been working on them for weeks, each draft more honest than the last. Elena read through Marcus's latest version, her heart catching on the raw vulnerability of his words. Elena, you taught me that love isn't about being perfect for someone, but about being perfectly honest with them. I promise to share my darkness with you so you can help me find the light. I promise to celebrate your strength without making you responsible for my healing. This line about sharing darkness, Elena said, her finger tracing his careful handwriting. Are you sure you want to include it? It's beautiful, but it's also very personal. Marcus looked up from reviewing her vows, which included her own promise to love all of you, including the parts that still hurt, while maintaining my own wholeness. Their ceremony would be small, but the handful of guests would include people who understood exactly what their promises meant. Dr. Chen says healthy relationships require voluntary vulnerability. Marcus said, I want everyone who cares about us to understand that this isn't a fairy tale romance. It's two people choosing to build something real together. Elena appreciated his commitment to honesty, but she also worried about his tendency toward brutal self-assessment. Marcus, you're not asking me to marry your trauma. You're asking me to marry you. The trauma is part of your experience, but it's not your identity. Marcus absorbed this distinction, still learning to separate his PTSD from his sense of self. So maybe I should say something about sharing all of myself, not just the difficult parts. What if you talked about sharing both your struggles and your strength, about trusting me with your whole story, not just the chapters that hurt? Marcus nodded, making notes in the margin of his draft. Writing vows had become another form of therapy, forcing him to articulate not just what he promised to do, but why those promises mattered. Your vows are beautiful too, he said, pointing to Elena's section about maintaining her own wholeness. But what does that mean practically? How do you stay whole while loving someone like me? Elena had struggled with this concept, wanting to honor her commitment to Marcus while acknowledging the hard-won lesson that she couldn't heal him through the force of her love alone. It means I promise to support your healing without making myself responsible for it, she explained, to be your partner, not your therapist, to take care of my own needs so I can be present for yours. Marcus understood the wisdom behind her promise, having learned through couples therapy that Elena's emotional well-being was essential to their relationship success. Her strength came not from self-sacrifice but from self-care, not from fixing him but from loving him while maintaining her own boundaries. Rodriguez offered to be our officiant, Marcus mentioned, referring to their friend who'd recently been ordained online specifically so he could perform their ceremony. Says it would be an honor to marry two people who've taught him what real commitment looks like. Elena smiled, picturing their wedding party. Rodriguez as officiant, Maria as her maid of honor, and two other veterans from Marcus's support group standing with him as groomsmen. Her family would be there too, finally convinced that Marcus was worthy of their daughter's love after witnessing his dedication to healing. My mother asked if we're planning to have children, Elena said carefully, aware that this conversation carried potential triggers for Marcus. Marcus paused in his writing, considering the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for months. His PTSD didn't disqualify him from fatherhood, but it did require careful consideration of how his mental health might affect any children they raised. What did you tell her? That we're focused on building a strong marriage first, and we'll discuss children when we're ready. But Marcus, I want you to know that your PTSD doesn't automatically make you unfit to be a father. It just means we'll need to be intentional about it. Marcus felt relief at Elena's practical approach, her refusal to let his mental health struggles dictate their entire future. I'd like children someday, maybe not right away, but someday. I want to be the kind of father who teaches them about resilience and healing, not just about survival. Elena reached across the table to squeeze his hand, the engagement ring he'd crafted from his dog tags warm against her skin. Then let's promise each other that too, to be intentional about building our family when the time is right. Marcus added a line to his vows about creating a home filled with healing, rather than just holding space for wounds. Elena added her own promise to choose hope over fear in all their future decisions. Their reared would be in 3 weeks, a small ceremony in Elena's parents' backyard, with homemade decorations and a potluck reception. Nothing fancy or expensive, but everything meaningful. "Are you nervous?" Elena asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Not about marrying you, about being married. Maybe. About being worthy of the promises we're making." "You're already worthy, Marcus. The vows are just making official what's already true." The morning sun filtered through Elena's childhood bedroom window as she slipped into her grandmother's wedding dress, the ivory silk altered to fit her smaller frame, but still carrying the weight of family history. Her mother fastened the tiny pearl buttons with careful fingers, each one a small ritual connecting 3 generations of women who had chosen love despite its complications. Abuela wore this dress when she married Abuelo in 1952. 32 years old, marrying a man who came home from Korea with nightmares he never talked about. Elena looked at herself in the antique mirror, seeing not just her reflection, but the ghost of her grandmother, who had loved a veteran through decades when PTSD wasn't even a recognized diagnosis, when men were expected to simply endure their demons in silence. Did she ever regret it, marrying someone so damaged by war? Elena's mother considered the question while adjusting the dress's train. "She told me once that she didn't marry his trauma. She married the man who was brave enough to seek healing, even when the world told him to suffer alone." She said Abuelo's willingness to fight for their love was what made him worthy of it. Across town, Marcus stood in his small apartment bathroom, adjusting his dress uniform with hands that shook only slightly. He debated wearing civilian clothes, wanting to leave his military identity in the past. But Elena had convinced him that his service was part of his story, not something to be hidden or ashamed of. The bronze star on his chest felt heavier than usual, Colonel Davidson's letter having recontextualized the medal from burden to honor. Rodriguez had helped him polish it the night before, both men understanding the significance of Marcus wearing his decorations proudly for the first time since his discharge. "You ready for this, brother?" Rodriguez asked, straightening his own suit jacket. As best man and efficient, he carried the dual responsibility of supporting Marcus and leading their ceremony. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Marcus replied, and meant. The backyard of Elena's childhood home had been transformed into a garden chapel, white chairs arranged in small circles rather than traditional rows, creating an intimate atmosphere where every guest felt included in the celebration. Elena had insisted on the circular arrangement, wanting their vows to be witnessed by community rather than performed for an audience. Elena's father waited at the kitchen door to walk her down the improvised aisle, his eyes bright with tears as he saw his daughter in her grandmother's dress. "You look beautiful, Misha, like your abuela on her wedding day." Marcus felt his breath catch as Elena appeared, the afternoon light making the silk dress shimmer as she moved toward him with confident steps. She wasn't walking toward marriage with nervous uncertainty, but with the assured grace of someone who had already chosen her partner through the hardest tests love could offer. The wedding photographer, a friend from Elena's work, captured the moment when Marcus first saw his bride, his face transformed by wonder and gratitude and joy so pure it made several guests reach for tissues. This wasn't the desperate clinging of 2 damaged people, but the celebration of 2 whole individuals choosing to build something together. Rodriguez began the ceremony with words he'd written specifically for them. "We gather today not to witness the beginning of Marcus and Elena's love story, but to celebrate its continuation. These 2 people have already proven their commitment through trials that would have broken weaker bonds." Elena's vows came first, her voice steady and clear as she spoke promises crafted from 2 years of choosing love over fear. "Marcus, you taught me that real strength isn't the absence of struggle, but the willingness to keep fighting. I promise to love all of you, including the parts that still heal, while honoring my own wholeness." I promise to build our future on truth rather than fantasy, on acceptance rather than the hope that you'll change. Marcus's vows followed, his military bearing softened by vulnerability as he spoke to Elena and their gathered community. Elena, you saved my life not by fixing me but by loving me while broken. You taught me that healing is possible, that I am worthy of love, that my scars tell a story of survival rather than failure. I promise to share my whole story with you, the darkness and the light. I promise to celebrate your strength without making you responsible for my healing. When Rodriguez pronounced them married, Marcus kissed Elena with reverence rather than passion, his hands gentle on her face, as if she was something precious he'd been granted permission to protect. The photographer captured that kiss, Elena's scars visible on Marcus's hands, his own visible through the thin fabric of his uniform. The reception unfolded with casual warmth, veterans and civilians mixing easily as they celebrated love that had survived real tests. Elena's grandmother's ring sparkled on her finger. Beside the engagement ring, Marcus had forged from his dog tags, old gold and transformed aluminum, creating something new together. We did it, Marcus whispered to Elena during their first dance to music played from a borrowed speaker system. We did, Elena agreed, her head resting against his shoulder as they moved slowly in the fading daylight. Around them, their chosen family celebrated not just their wedding, but their victory over the forces that had tried to convince them that broken people weren't worthy of lasting love. The house keys felt solid and hopeful in Elena's hand as they stood before the front door of their first home together, a modest craftsman bungalow with wide windows and a wraparound porch that had convinced them both at first sight. After 18 months of marriage spent in Elena's apartment, having their own space felt like the final piece of their foundation, clicking into place. It's really ours, Marcus said, still somewhat amazed by the concept of home ownership. The VA loan had made it possible, but the idea of having a place that belonged entirely to them remained foreign to a man who had spent his adult life in military housing and rental apartments. Elena turned the key and pushed open the door, stepping into the empty living room where afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that would need new curtains. The hardwood floors creaked under their feet with the honest sounds of a house that had sheltered other families, other dreams, other new beginnings. The veterans program at the community center wants me to start leading a support group, Marcus mentioned as they walked through rooms, still echoing with possibility, for recently discharged soldiers dealing with the transition to civilian life. Elena turned to face him, recognizing the significance of this offer. 6 months ago, Marcus could barely attend group therapy as a participant. Now he was being asked to guide others through the same journey. What did you tell them? That I'd think about it? That I'd talk to you first? Marcus ran his hand along the kitchen counter, solid butcher block that spoke of meals prepared and shared, of ordinary domestic happiness he was still learning to trust. Marcus, you don't need my permission to help other veterans, but what's making you hesitate? Marcus considered the question as they moved into what would be their bedroom, the room where he'd need to manage his nightmares without disturbing neighbors through thin apartment walls. The space felt safer somehow, more contained and controllable. Imposter syndrome, maybe. Like, who am I to guide other people's healing when I'm still figuring out my own? What if I say the wrong thing? What if my advice makes someone's situation worse? Elena understood his concerns, but also recognized the growth they represented. The Marcus she'd first met would never have considered taking responsibility for other people's well-being, too convinced of his own brokenness to imagine having anything valuable to offer. Remember what Dr. Chen said about wounded healers? Sometimes the people best equipped to help others are those who've walked the same difficult path. Marcus nodded, thinking of the veterans who had helped him most during his own darkest periods. They hadn't been polished professionals with pristine mental health records. They had been scarred survivors who understood his struggles from the inside. Rodriguez thinks I should do it, says I have a way of making people feel heard without judgment. Rodriguez is right. You listened to me through 2 years of my own struggles with loving someone with PTSD. You never made me feel guilty for being tired, or frustrated or scared. Elena's observation surprised Marcus. He'd been so focused on his own healing journey that he'd overlooked how much he'd grown in his ability to support others, including Elena herself. They found themselves in the small second bedroom that would serve as Marcus's office, where he could write in his journal and attend virtual therapy sessions and perhaps eventually meet with veterans who needed guidance from someone who understood their battles. The program coordinator mentioned that they're seeing a lot of younger veterans, people coming back from deployments that lasted longer and involved more complex trauma than previous generations dealt with. Marcus continued. Kids who are 18, 19 years old, trying to figure out how to be civilians when they've never really been adults without military structure. Elena heard the compassion in his voice, the protective instinct that had made him a good squad leader, now redirected toward helping, rather than just surviving. You could make a real difference in their lives, or I could make their problems worse by giving them advice from someone who's still figuring things out. Elena took his hands, feeling the familiar texture of scars that had become part of their shared geography, no longer symbols of damage, but markers of endurance. Marcus, you're not still figuring things out. You figured out how to love and be loved, how to ask for help when you need it, how to take care of your mental health, how to be a partner and friend and contributing member of your community. That's not someone who's still lost. That's someone who's found his way. Marcus looked around their empty house, seeing it filled with the life they would build together. Morning coffee in the kitchen, friends gathered around a dining room table they hadn't bought yet, quiet evenings in the living room, reading beside each other in comfortable silence. When I was deployed, I used to think about what home would feel like when I got back, he said. I imagined it would be about safety, about being away from danger. But it's not about the absence of threat. It's about the presence of love. Elena smiled, understanding that Marcus had found his definition of home not in the absence of struggle, but in the presence of people committed to facing struggles together. So will you take the job? She asked. Yeah, Marcus said, his voice carrying new certainty. I think I will. Outside, their neighborhood settled into evening routines, other families finishing dinner and helping children with homework, the ordinary rhythms of civilian life that Marcus was finally ready to join, as a participant rather than an observer. Marcus closed his new journal, the one he'd started after their wedding, and set it on the nightstand beside the old one that chronicled his journey from self-loathing to self-acceptance. The final entry was simple but profound. Today, Elena and I helped Jake and Sarah work through their first major PTSD episode as a married couple. Watching them discover that love can survive the worst moments reminded me how far we've traveled from that night when I thought I wasn't good enough for. 3 years had passed since Marcus's thunderstorm breakdown, 2 years since their wedding, and 6 months since they'd started facilitating couples therapy groups for military families. The living room of their craftsman bungalow had become a sanctuary for other couples navigating the complex intersection of love and trauma. Elena emerged from the bathroom, her face glowing with the secret she'd been carrying for 2 weeks. In her hand, she held a pregnancy test, the positive result clear and unmistakable. They'd been trying for 6 months, both of them finally convinced that Marcus's healing had progressed enough to support the demands of parenthood. Marcus, she said softly, settling beside him on the bed they'd chosen together, in the house they'd made their own. He looked up from his journal, noting the particular quality of her smile that suggested important news. What is it? Elena placed the pregnancy test on his journal, watching his face transform as he absorbed what the 2 pink lines meant. For a moment, he was speechless, his mind cycling through excitement and terror and overwhelming gratitude. Are you sure? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. As sure as science can make us. Dr. Martinez confirmed it this afternoon. Marcus stared at the test, seeing not just pregnancy but the future they'd been building piece by piece through therapy and honest conversation, and the daily choice to love each other despite their imperfections. A child would complicate everything, would require new levels of healing and communication and trust. Are you scared? Elena asked, reading his expression accurately. Terrified, Marcus admitted, What if I pass on my trauma? What if my PTSD affects our child's development? What if I have a flashback while holding our baby? Elena had anticipated these fears, having wrestled with similar questions herself. Dr. Chern says children of parents in recovery often develop exceptional emotional intelligence because they grow up understanding that healing is possible, that struggles don't define people. Marcus absorbed this perspective, thinking of the veterans in their support group who'd become fathers and mothers while managing their own mental health challenges. Their children weren't damaged by their parents' trauma. They were strengthened by witnessing their parents' commitment to healing. Besides, Elena continued, you've already proven you can take care of people who are vulnerable. Every veteran in our support group trusts you with their worst moments. Our child will grow up knowing their father is someone who helps broken people become whole. Through their bedroom window, Marcus could see the garden they'd planted together. Vegetables and flowers growing side by side in soil they'd prepared with patient attention. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. They'd been cultivating not just plants, but their relationship, their individual healing, their capacity to nurture life in all its forms. I want this, Marcus said finally, placing his hand over Elena's still flat stomach. I want to raise a child with you, to teach them about resilience and love and the importance of asking for help when you need it. Elena leaned against his shoulder, imagining their future expanded to include small hands and sleepy mornings and the particular chaos that comes with tiny humans who depend entirely on their parents' love and wisdom. What do you think they'll call the thunderstorm story when they're older? Elena asked, referring to the family legend Marcus's breakdown had become, reframed through years of healing from catastrophe to turning point. The night Daddy learned he was worth loving, Marcus suggested, the phrase carrying none of the shame that had once defined that memory. Their phone rang, displaying the number of Jake Morrison, the young Marine they'd been counseling through his transition to civilian life and new marriage. Marcus answered, knowing that crisis calls were part of their commitment to the veteran community they'd joined as participants, and now served as leaders. Jake, everything okay? Marcus, I did it. Told Sarah about the worst thing that happened over there, the thing I thought would make her leave. She's still here. She's not going anywhere. Marcus smiled, catching Elena's eye as she listened to half the conversation. How does it feel? Like I can finally breathe? Like maybe I'm not as broken as I thought? You were never broken, Jake. Just wounded. And wounds heal when you stop picking at them and start taking care of them properly. After ending the call, Marcus pulled Elena closer, their bodies fitting together with the familiar comfort of people who'd learned to love each other's sharp edges and soft places equally. Perfect love, Elena murmured against his chest, referencing the phrase that had become their private shorthand for relationships that embraced imperfection. Perfect love, Marcus agreed, his hand still resting on her stomach where their child was beginning the same journey they'd taken, from potential to reality, from hope to fulfillment. Outside their window, the garden grew in the darkness, roots reaching deep while green shoots reached toward the light, proving that beautiful things could flourish even in imperfect soil.